My Aunt Marisol handed me the damp dish towel, her smile warm but her fingers pressing just a fraction too hard into my wrist. "You've always been the good one, Valerie," she whispered over the hum of the old refrigerator, "which is why we need to keep this between us until your mother leaves tomorrow." I looked down at the crumpled medical summary she had just slipped into my apron pocket, the bold letters "advanced stage" bleeding through the cheap thermal paper. Only 48 hours ago, Marisol had been the one holding my hand at the kitchen table, promising that whatever happened to Grandma, we would navigate it as a family. Now, she was already moving the chess pieces, ensuring my own mother, her younger sister, was kept completely in the dark. The house smelled of simmering eucalyptus and damp wool, the familiar, heavy scent of my grandmother's twilight years. For the past decade, since I turned 22, this three-bedroom craftsman had been my entire world. While my cousins went off to out-of-state universities and my mother built her real estate firm 2 hours away in the city, I stayed behind. I was the niece who didn't mind changing the linens. I was the granddaughter who learned how to puree vegetables so they wouldn't choke her. And Marisol had cheered me on every step of the way, dropping off Tupperware containers of lasagna and calling me her saving grace. But tonight, the atmosphere in the kitchen felt different. The air was thick, charged with a sudden, sharp calculation. "She doesn't need the stress right now, Val," Marisol continued, her voice dropping into that smooth, comforting cadence she used when she wanted to settle an argument before it even started. She began wiping down the laminate counter, her movements methodical, almost aggressive. "Your mother has that big closing on Monday. If we tell her Grandma's heart is failing now, she'll just panic and ruin everything. Let's just let her have a peaceful weekend." A peaceful weekend? My voice sounded hollow, scraping against my throat. "Marisol, the doctor said weeks, maybe less. Mom deserves to know she's saying goodbye." Marisol stopped wiping. She didn't look at me, but her shoulders went rigid beneath her beige cardigan. The silence stretched between us, punctured only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the pendulum clock in the hallway. When she finally turned around, the soft, maternal aunt I had known my entire life was gone. In her place stood a woman with cold, appraising eyes. "And what happens when your mother panics, Valerie?" Marisol asked, her tone chillingly conversational. "She comes in here, she changes the care plan, she questions the doctors, and she makes these final days a circus. I've managed this family's affairs since your grandfather died. I know how to handle the burden. You just need to keep doing what you do best. Take care of your grandmother. Leave the heavy lifting to me." She patted my cheek, a gesture that used to feel like affection but now felt entirely like a warning, and walked out toward the living room, where the muffled sound of my mother's laughter echoed over the television. I stood alone in the kitchen, my hand gripping the edge of the sink until my knuckles turned white. I pulled the crumpled paper from my pocket, unfolding it with trembling fingers. It wasn't just a medical update. Tucked behind the physician's note was a power of attorney amendment, dated 3 days ago, bearing my grandmother's shaky, barely legible signature. Marisol hadn't just been hiding a diagnosis. She had already quietly closed the door on the rest of us. The next morning, the kitchen was flooded with sharp, unforgiving spring sunlight. My mother, Claudia, sat at the table in her tailored linen trousers, swirling a spoonful of honey into her tea. She looked so entirely out of place among the faded floral wallpaper and the chipped linoleum. A woman whose life ran on tight schedules and commission checks, completely oblivious to the countdown that had just begun in the bedroom down the hall. "Marisol said I should head out before the afternoon traffic hits the bridge," Claudia said, not looking up from her tablet. "She offered to stay through Tuesday so you can get some errands done, Val. It's sweet of her. Usually I have to beg her to take a turn." I stood by the stove, my back to her, watching the kettle begin to rattle. My apron pocket felt heavy, the sharp corners of the folded amendment scraping against my hip with every micro-movement. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drop the kettle, sit across from her, and smooth that crumpled paper flat on the table between us. "Look at what your sister did while you were at your hotel last night." But as I turned around, I caught sight of Marisol standing in the shadow of the hallway corridor. She was leaning against the doorframe, a mug of black coffee cradled in both hands. She wasn't smiling anymore. She just watched me, her gaze unblinking, heavy with the silent reminder of what she had said the night before. Leave the heavy lifting to me. Valerie, Claudia looked up, her brow furrowing slightly at my silence. Are you listening to me? You look pale. Are you getting enough sleep? I'm fine, Mom, I managed to say, my voice level but dry. Just thinking about the grocery list. Well, make sure Marisol pays for half, Claudia said, shifting her attention back to her screen with a dismissive wave. She acts like this house is a charity case, but she has more than enough from her husband's settlement to help with Grandma's upkeep. Marisol didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped smoothly into the light of the kitchen, her demeanor instantly shifting back to the doting elder sister. Oh, don't worry about the groceries, Claudia. Val and I have a system. You just focus on your big listing tomorrow. We've got everything under control here. The casual ease of her lie made my stomach twist. It wasn't just that she was hiding the truth. It was how effortlessly she donned the mask of the selfless caretaker. For years, I had looked up to her. When my mother was too busy with her career to show up to my community college graduation, Marisol was the one who brought a bouquet of carnations. When Grandma first started forgetting her keys, Marisol was the one who validated my fears while my mother brushed them off as just old age. Now, I realized that every piece of validation, every gentle pat on the back, had been a deposit into a bank of unearned trust. An hour later, I stood on the porch, watching Claudia's sleek silver sedan back down the gravel driveway. The air was crisp, carrying the faint, sweet scent of damp earth and blooming lilac. Marisol stood beside me, waving until the car disappeared around the bend of the old oak trees. The moment the sound of the engine faded, Marisol's hand dropped to her side. She didn't look at me as she spoke, her voice dropping an octave into that cold, businesslike registry. The notary is coming at 2:00, she said, adjusting the cuffs of her cardigan. I need you to make sure your grandmother is awake, alert, and dressed in something decent. No nightgowns. I froze, my foot hovering on the top step of the porch. A notary? Marisol, you already have the signed amendment. I saw the paper. Marisol finally turned her head, a small, humorless smile touching the corners of her mouth. That was just the preliminary draft, Valerie. Today, we make it permanent. And if you care about keeping this house in the family, the house you've spent 10 years taking care of, you'll help me make sure she signs it without a fuss. Grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 1:45. In the quiet bedroom, the air was thick with the scent of rubbing alcohol and the lavender talcum powder Grandma had used since the 1960s. She sat on the edge of her mattress, her small frame swallowed by a stiff, navy blue cardigan Marisol had picked out. Her thin, translucent hands hovered over her lap, trembling slightly as she tried to smooth the wrinkles in her wool skirt. Valerie, sweetheart, Grandma whispered, her cloudy eyes searching my face as I knelt to tie her shoes. Where is Claudia, I thought. I thought I heard her voice this morning. My throat tightened. I could hear Marisol down the hall, opening and closing drawers, her sharp heels clicking against the hardwood like a countdown. Mom had to go back to the city for work, Grandma, I said quietly, keeping my eyes fixed on the cotton laces. She had a big meeting. Oh, a shadow of profound disappointment crossed her weathered face, her shoulders slumping further. She's always so busy. Marisol stays, though. Marisol is always here. It was a narrative Marisol had carefully cultivated for a decade, a slow-dripping poison that painted my mother as the selfish, absent daughter while Marisol was the dutiful martyr. The truth was far heavier. My mother's frantic work paid the steep property taxes on this house and covered the soaring costs of Grandma's medications. Marisol simply showed up with the casseroles and the paperwork, occupying the emotional space my mother was too exhausted to claim. The front doorbell rang, a harsh double chime that made Grandma jump. She's here, Marisol's voice cut through the quiet as she stepped into the bedroom. She didn't look at me. Her focus was entirely on Grandma. Her face was a mask of gentle, agonizingly fake maternal warmth. Come along, Mama. Just a few quick signatures for the insurance updates, and then Valerie will make you some tea. I watched Marisol take Grandma's elbow, guiding her up with an exaggerated tenderness that made my stomach turn. I followed them into the dining room, where a severe-looking woman in a charcoal blazer was already laying out legal documents across the lace tablecloth. "Mrs. Vance," the notary asked, her tone professional but detached. "My name is Evelyn. I'm here to witness your signature on the updated asset management and health proxy forms." Grandma looked at the dense blocks of text, her eyes darting nervously toward Marisol. "Asset management? I thought my affairs were settled when Arthur passed." "They were, Mama," Marisol said, her hand resting heavily on Grandma's shoulder, her thumb digging slightly into the fabric of the cardigan. "But with your health changing, we just need to centralize things. It makes it easier for me to pay the nurses. You remember what we talked about last week, when Claudia wanted to sell the house?" I choked back a breath. Sell the house? My mother had never suggested that. It was a manufactured lie, a calculated strike designed to trigger Grandma's deepest fear of losing her home. Grandma's breath hitched. She looked at the pen in the notary's hand, her fingers twitching. "Claudia wants to sell? No, this is Arthur's house." "I know, Mama. That's why we're doing this. To protect it," Marisol murmured, her voice dripping with artificial comfort as she slid the pen into Grandma's shaking hand. "Just sign here, and here. Valerie and I will take care of the rest." Grandma lifted the pen, her hand hovering over the dotted line. She looked across the table at me, her eyes pleading, silently asking for the truth. Marisol's grip on her shoulder tightened just a fraction, a silent command. I looked at my grandmother, then at my aunt, realizing with terrifying clarity that if I spoke up now, Marisol would lock me out of this house before the sun went down, and Grandma would spend her final weeks completely alone with a monster. I swallowed the lump of glass in my throat and looked down at my own hands, laced tightly behind my back. "It's okay, Grandma," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "Just sign where Aunt Marisol is showing you." The relief on Marisol's face was instantaneous, a brief flash of triumph that she quickly smothered beneath a mask of somber responsibility. Grandma's shaky hand descended, the scratch of the ballpoint pen against the heavy bond paper sounding like a small, violent tearing in the silent room. Once, twice, a third time. The notary, Evelyn, watched with the cold neutrality of someone who witnessed family betrayals for a living. She stamped the documents with a heavy, metallic thud that signaled the official end of my mother's rights, and mine. "All set," Evelyn said, sliding the papers into a leather portfolio. Marisol escorted her to the front door, their whispered conversation murmuring in the hallway like distant thunder. I sank into the chair next to Grandma. She looked suddenly smaller, her eyes staring blankly at the empty lace tablecloth, her fingers still twitching as if she were still holding the pen. "I'm tired, Valerie," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "I want to go back to my room." "I know, Grandma, let's go." As I helped her up, I noticed a tiny drop of blood on the tablecloth. Grandma had bitten her lips so hard while signing that she had broken the skin. I wiped it away with the edge of my apron before Marisol could come back into the room. By 4 in the afternoon, Grandma was asleep, her breathing heavy and rattling under the faded yellow quilt. Marisol was in the kitchen, making a fresh pot of coffee, the triumphant clatter of mugs and spoons letting me know she considered the day an absolute victory. I walked into the kitchen, my boots clicking softly on the linoleum. Marisol didn't turn around. She was leaning against the counter, staring out the window at the overgrown garden. "You did the right thing today, Val," she said, her tone light, almost celebratory. "I won't forget it. When the time comes and we sell this place, I'll make sure you get a generous cut. More than your mother, that's for sure. You've earned it." I stood by the old refrigerator, watching the way the afternoon light hit the side of her face, revealing the sharp, bitter lines around her mouth. She didn't want to save the house. She had used Grandma's fear of losing it just to strip my mother of her inheritance, and now she was planning to liquidate it anyway. "And Mom," I asked quietly, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion, "when are we telling her about the diagnosis?" Marisol turned around, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "We'll tell her when the time is right, maybe next weekend. After I've had time to move Grandma's savings into the new trust account. If Claudia finds out before then, she'll hire a lawyer and tie everything up in probate for months. We can't afford that, Valerie. Grandma's care is expensive. Right, I murmured. The care. Exactly, Marisol smiled, reaching out to pat my arm. I knew I could count on your good sense. She walked past me toward the living room, leaving her half-empty coffee mug on the counter. I stared at the dark liquid, the surface completely still. My aunt thought she had bought my silence with the promise of a payday. She thought because I had spent 10 years quietly cleaning up after this family, I was entirely devoid of a spine. I waited until I heard the television click on in the living room. Then, I pulled my phone from my pocket, walked into the pantry, and dialed my mother's number. The phone rang 3 times before my mother answered. The background noise on her end was a chaotic symphony of city traffic, honking horns, and the sharp clatter of her heels against concrete. Valerie, is everything all right? Claudia's voice was clipped, breathless, already managing 3 things at once. I just got back to the office. If this is about the grocery list again. Mom, I interrupted, my voice a forced whisper as I leaned against the cold wooden shelves of the pantry. I kept my eyes on the slit of light beneath the door, listening for the sound of Marisol's footsteps. Don't say anything, just listen. Grandma is dying. The line went dead silent. The ambient noise of the city seemed to vanish, swallowed by a sudden, heavy vacuum. What are you talking about? My mother finally whispered, the professional armor cracking instantly. She was fine this morning. She was sitting right there. Marisol has been hiding the medical summaries, I said, the words spilling out fast and low. The doctor gave her weeks. Her heart is failing, Mom, and Marisol just brought a notary to the house. She lied to Grandma, told her you were trying to sell the house, and made her sign over a power of attorney amendment and the asset management rights. Marisol is moving the savings into a private trust on Monday. I heard a sharp, ragged gasp on the other end of the line. She did what? Marisol wouldn't. She did, Mom. I stood right there and watched it happen because if I stopped her, she would have kicked me out and left Grandma alone. You need to get back here, but don't come tonight. If you show up screaming, Marisol will just use the new legal papers to lock the doors and call the police. We need to do this carefully. Carefully, Claudia's voice rose, vibrating with a mixture of raw panic and fury. Valerie, she is stealing my mother. She is rewriting our entire family because she's always been jealous of. Mom, look at me, I said, forgetting for a moment that she couldn't see me through the phone. Listen to my voice. For 10 years, I've watched the 2 of you play these games. But right now, Grandma is the one caught in the middle. If you come in here like a storm, Marisol wins because she has the paperwork to back her up. Let her think she won. Let her go to the bank on Monday morning. And what are you going to do? Claudia demanded, her breathing ragged. I'm going to do what I've always done, I whispered, looking down at my worn-out boots. I'm going to take care of Grandma, and I'm going to find the original files Marisol keeps in her briefcase. The television in the living room suddenly went quiet. The floorboards in the hallway creaked. I have to go. I clicked the off button before my mother could reply, sliding the phone into my apron pocket just as the pantry door swung open. Marisol stood there, holding an empty plate, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at me in the dim light of the shelving. Who were you talking to, Valerie? I didn't blink. I reached down for a dusty jar of preserved peaches on the lowest shelf, letting my fingers coat themselves in a layer of grime before turning around. The pharmacy, I said, my voice flat, completely devoid of the panic hammering against my ribs. I was checking if Grandma's liquid morphine prescription had been filled yet. The nurse said we'll need it by Wednesday if the restlessness starts. Marisol stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds, her eyes scanning my face for a twitch, a shadow, anything that would give away the betrayal I had just set in motion. Slowly, the tension left her shoulders, replaced by that familiar, condescending softness. She set her empty plate on the counter behind her. Good girl, she murmured, leaning against the pantry doorframe. You're anticipating. That's what makes you so indispensable, Val. I honestly don't know how your mother raised someone so practical. She certainly doesn't have a practical bone in her body. She's focused on other things, I replied, stepping past her into the kitchen light, carefully cradling the glass jar. Exactly, other things, Marisol echoed, a sharp edge of old resentment cutting through her voice. Like her listings, her commissions, her city life, she forgets who stayed in the mud to keep this family from sinking. She reached out, adjusting the collar of my shirt with an unsettlingly intimate possessiveness. Go wash your hands, sweetheart. We need to start dinner. That night, the house was suffocatingly quiet. I lay awake in my small bedroom off the kitchen, listening to the rhythmic, wet rattling of Grandma's breath down the hall. Every intake of air sounded like a struggle against a rising tide. At 2:00 a.m., I slipped out of bed, my bare feet navigating the floorboards with the practiced silence of someone who had lived in the shadows of this house for a decade. Marisol's leather briefcase sat on the armchair in the dark den, its brass buckles gleaming faintly in the moonlight spilling through the curtains. My hands shook as I knelt before it. It wasn't locked. Marisol's arrogance was a fortress. She truly believed I was too broken, too submissive to ever look inside. The leather groaned softly as I lifted the flap. Inside, filed neatly behind colored dividers, was the true extent of my aunt's calculation. There were bank statements showing Grandma's life savings, nearly $200,000, already marked with transfer routing numbers for Monday morning. But beneath those was a folder labeled Claudia. I opened it, my eyes straining in the dim light. It contained copies of old receipts, a ledger of every dime my mother had sent for Grandma's care over the past 5 years, alongside forged invoices showing that the care had supposedly cost double. Marisol hadn't just been hoarding Grandma's love. She had been systematically skimming from my mother's financial contributions, building a nest egg out of Claudia's guilt. Suddenly, a floorboard groaned right outside the den door. I froze, holding my breath, the forged invoices clutched tightly against my chest. The shadow outside the door shifted, blocking the thin sliver of light from the hallway nightlight. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I squeezed my eyes shut, sliding the forged invoices back into the folder with agonizing slowness, millimeter by millimeter, ensuring the paper didn't rustle. Valerie! Marisol's voice was a low, sandpaper rasp in the dark. I let go of the briefcase, dropped my hands to my lap, and let my head sink onto my chest. I took a deep, shuddering breath, exhaling a long, trembling sigh. I didn't move. I forced my posture to sag, mimicking the heavy, boneless weight of a person who had simply collapsed from exhaustion. The door pushed open further. The soft pad of her slippers approached until she was standing directly over me. The scent of her expensive lavender hand cream filled the small room, a suffocating sweetness. Valerie, what are you doing in here? She reached down, her hand gripping my shoulder and shaking me, not gently. I let my eyes flutter open, blinking heavily against the darkness, putting on the groggy, disoriented mask of someone pulled from a deep sleep. Marisol, I mumbled, rubbing my face. I'm sorry, I came in to look for the heating pad for Grandma. I must have sat down for a second and just blacked out. Marisol's eyes immediately darted down to her briefcase. It was closed, the brass buckles precisely where they had been, but her gaze lingered on it with a sharp, predatory suspicion. She looked back at me, her fingers tightening on my shoulder until it bruised. The heating pad is in the linen closet, Valerie. Not in the den, she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy whisper. You're exhausted. You're starting to wander. If you can't keep your head straight, I'm going to have to hire a night nurse, and you know what that means. Less of an inheritance for you when this is all over. I know, I whispered, letting my voice shake just enough to satisfy her need for dominance. I'm sorry, my head is just spinning. I'll go back to bed. See that you do, she said, stepping back to let me pass. She didn't leave the room until she had picked up the briefcase and cradled it against her chest like a shield. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay on top of my blankets, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. By 8:00 a.m. Monday morning, Marisol was already dressed in her finest navy suit, her car keys jingling in her hand. She stood by the kitchen island, hurriedly sipping her coffee, her eyes bright with the manic energy of a woman about to claim her prize. The banks would open in an hour. "I have some legal errands to run in town, Val," she said, checking her gold watch. "I'll be gone for about 2 hours. Keep Grandma comfortable. Don't answer the door for anyone." "I won't," I said, pouring her a travel mug of coffee. I smiled, a small, compliant, empty smile. "Good luck with the insurance updates." The moment her car tires crunched down the gravel driveway, the quiet of the house changed. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage. I pulled my phone out and typed a single word to my mother. "Now." 20 minutes later, the gravel driveway groaned under the weight of a car pulling in fast. I stood by the front window, holding Grandma's untouched oatmeal, watching my mother open the door of her silver sedan. She wasn't wearing her crisp city linen today. She wore an oversized dark sweater, her hair pulled back into a hasty, messy knot. Her face was pale, lined with the exhaustion of a 2-hour drive spent staring at the highway and reckoning with a decade of blind trust. She didn't knock. She burst through the front door, the heavy oak frame slamming against the wall with a crack that echoed through the quiet house. "Where is she?" Claudia gasped, her chest heaving, her eyes wild as they scanned the hallway. "Where is Marisol?" "She went to the First National Bank on Elm Street," I said, my voice steady, grounding the panic vibrating in the air. "She left 20 minutes ago. She thinks she has 2 hours before anyone notices the funds moving." Claudia took 2 steps toward the den, her keys clutched so tightly in her fist they looked like a weapon. "I'm going down there. I'm going to stop the manager. I'm going to call the police right from the lobby." "No, Mom, wait," I said, stepping into her path and placing a hand on her arm. Her sleeve was cold from the morning air. "If you go to the bank causing a scene, Marisol will just flash the power of attorney Grandma signed on Saturday. The bank will look at the notary's stamp, see a legal document, and tell you it's a civil matter. You'll lose the window." Claudia looked at me, her eyes filling with a mixture of rage and sudden, desperate helplessness. "Then what do we do, Valerie? Just let her drain everything my father worked for. Let her steal the money I sent to keep this roof over my mother's head." "We don't go to the bank," I said quietly, guiding her toward the dining room table where the ghost of Saturday's betrayal still lingered. "We use what she left behind." I pulled a small flash drive from my pocket and laid it on the lace tablecloth. "What is that?" Claudia whispered. "Last night, after she went back to her room, I went back into the den," I said. "She took the briefcase with her, but she forgot she had left her old personal laptop plugged into the printer outlet behind the desk. She kept her digital ledger synced to it. I copied every forged invoice, every dual ledger statement, and the actual medical reports dating back 6 months. The doctor explicitly warned her 3 months ago that Grandma was losing cognitive capacity. The signature she got on Saturday isn't just unethical, it's legally void because Grandma wasn't competent to sign it." Claudia stared at the tiny plastic drive, her breathing slowing down, her real estate brain finally clicking into gear. She looked up at me, a profound, painful realization dawning in her eyes. "You've been holding all of this by yourself." "I've been holding it for 10 years, Mom," I said softly. "But right now, we need to call the family estate lawyer. Not to fight the power of attorney, but to freeze the accounts under emergency elder abuse protocols. And we need to do it before Marisol signs the transfer slip." Silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the low, agonizing rattle of Grandma's breath from the bedroom. My mother stared at the flash drive on the table, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The high-powered city executive had completely vanished. She was just a daughter realizing she had been systematically locked out of her own mother's final days. "David Harris," Claudia whispered, her voice cracking as she pulled her phone out. "He handled your grandfather's estate. He's retired now, but he still answers my calls. If I tell him what's on this drive, if I tell him Marisol used a fraudulent competency status." "Call him," I said, checking my watch. It was 9:15 a.m. The bank had been open for 15 minutes. "Tell him to file an emergency ex parte injunction to freeze all assets associated with Grandma's name. Give him the routing numbers from the ledger. I'll print the doctor's cognitive assessment right now." For the next 45 minutes, the dining room transformed into a quiet war room. The old printer in the corner groaned and clicked, spitting out pages of medical records and dual-ledger entries that detailed 5 years of systematic theft. Claudia paced the floorboards, her voice dropping into a sharp, lethal professional register as she dictated terms to the lawyer. There were no tears now. There was only the cold, precise execution of legal self-defense. At exactly 10:05 a.m., Claudia's phone buzzed with a text message. She looked down, a grim, satisfied stillness settling over her features. "David did it," she whispered, looking up at me. "The probate judge signed the emergency temporary restraining order. The bank just flagged the trust account. Marisol can't move a single dime. In fact, if she's still at the branch trying to push the transfer through, she's about to have a very uncomfortable conversation with the branch manager." Right on cue, the sound of gravel crunching violently outside signaled Marisol's return. The front door didn't just open. It flew back against the wall so hard the drywall cracked behind it. Marisol stormed into the hallway, her navy suit jacket slightly askew, her face mottled with a dark, furious purple. Her pristine leather briefcase was clutched in her hand like a weapon. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her eyes locking onto my mother, completely ignoring me as if I were still just a piece of the furniture. "Claudia, what the hell did you do to the accounts? The manager told me the funds are locked under a judicial review. They threatened to call corporate legal." Claudia didn't flinch. She sat calmly at the dining room table, surrounded by the neatly stacked piles of printed invoices and medical records. She took a slow sip of her cold tea, her eyes fixed on her sister with a detachment that was utterly terrifying. "I didn't do anything, Marisol," Claudia said softly. "The state of California did, because asset protection laws tend to kick in when you try to rob a dying woman who doesn't even know her own name anymore." Marisol froze, her gaze shifting slowly from my mother to the stacks of paper on the table, and finally to me. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The quiet, compliant niece who had spent 10 years changing linens wasn't standing behind her anymore. I was standing next to the printer, holding the final page of the doctor's report. Marisol took a step toward me, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The polished, maternal facade she had worn for decades didn't just crack, it shattered completely, revealing a raw, desperate panic. "You," she whispered, her finger shaking as she pointed it at my chest. "You did this. After everything I gave you, I treated you like my own daughter, Valerie. I took care of you while your mother was off living her life." "You didn't take care of me, Marisol," I said, my voice steady, echoing clearly in the quiet dining room. "You used me as a shield so you could sit in the dark and hollow out this family. You didn't stay to help Grandma. You stayed because she was an account you hadn't finished draining." Marisol dropped her briefcase onto the floor with a heavy, hollow thud. She looked at Claudia, then back at me, her mouth twisting into a bitter, ugly line. For the first time, I saw her for what she truly was, not a mastermind, just a deeply insecure woman who had built her entire identity on a mountain of manufactured grievances. "You think you've won?" Marisol hissed, her voice trembling with an toxic blend of jealousy and spite. "Go ahead, take the accounts, take the house. Let's see how long the two of you last when the nurses start calling and the real work begins. You'll be begging me to come back within a week." "The door is behind you, Marisol," Claudia said, her voice dropping into a quiet, lethal finality. "If you're not out of this house in 5 minutes, David's next call is to the police department for elder financial exploitation. I have the ledger. I have the receipts. Don't test me." Marisol stared at her sister, searching for a bluff, but found only a wall of cold stone. Without another word, she scooped up her briefcase, her sharp heels clicking a frantic, humiliating retreat down the hallway. The front door slammed shut, and a moment later, the spray of gravel outside signaled her permanent departure from our lives. The sudden silence in the house was deafening. Claudia sat down heavily at the table, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook, a decade of buried guilt and sudden relief finally breaking through her professional armor. I walked over and placed a hand on her back, feeling the ragged warmth of her breath. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The money was safe. The house was secure, but the cost of the truth weighed heavily on both of us. From down the hall, a faint, rhythmic tapping broke the quiet. I left the dining room and walked into the bedroom. Grandma was awake, her cloudy eyes staring up at the ceiling, her thin fingers tapping gently against the edge of the yellow quilt. The wet, rattling sound in her chest had slowed, settling into a quiet, peaceful rhythm. I sat on the edge of the mattress, taking her fragile, cool hand in mine. A moment later, the floorboards creaked softly, and Claudia stepped into the room. She looked at her mother, then at me, her eyes red but clear. Slowly, awkwardly, Claudia knelt on the other side of the bed, reaching out to touch Grandma's shoulder. There was no grand celebration, no overwhelming sense of triumph. There was just the quiet, heavy reality of a family finally stripped of its illusions. For 10 years, I had protected this house from the outside world. Now, as the afternoon sun cast long, gentle shadows across the faded floral wallpaper, I realized I had finally protected it from the inside, too. We were broken, and the time left was short, but for the first time in my life, the air in the room was entirely clean.